Fantastic. Welcome to the Carnegie Endowment meeting on what Americans really think about the UN. I'm Stewart Patrick, Senior Fellow and Director of Carnegie's Global Order and Institutions Program. The bedrock institution of world order, of course, is the United Nations, the premier universal membership organization, which has a legally binding charter. It's marking its 80th anniversary, of course, this year, and it's doing so at a time of tremendous global upheaval, including geopolitical competition, rising levels of violent conflict, economic nationalism, abrupt technological change, stalled development, and a deepening climate emergency, among other major challenges. On top of these destabilizing trends, the United Nations has lost the confidence and support of its most powerful member and leading financial contributor, the United States. Since taking office, the Trump administration has launched a broad-based assault on international organizations, multilateral institutions, and international law. It has proposed, through a combination of budget cuts and rescissions, to slash funding for international organizations by more than 80%, including a cessation of all U.S. support for UN peacekeeping operations, precipitating a massive financial crisis for the world body that the UN is trying to adjust to. The administration has also announced its departure from numerous UN agencies and treaties, including the World Health Organization, UNESCO, UN Human Rights Council, and the Paris Climate Agreement. Many more may also be on the chopping block. In February, the president asked Secretary of State Marco Rubio to launch a review of all international organizations and treaties of which the U.S. is a member or a party, and to provide recommendations for withdrawal of any that no longer, in their view, serve U.S. national interests. Within UN settings, meanwhile, the administration has adopted a very assertive America First stance, claiming in many cases that the world body is antithetical to U.S. interests and values. It has accused the United Nations of infringing on U.S. sovereignty by imposing its will on the American people, of espousing a woke ideology, including in its focus on gender equality and socialist conceptions of human rights and sustainable development, of abetting and corruption and wasting taxpayer funds, and of course of endangering U.S. economic prosperity with a misguided focus on climate change. The administration, meanwhile, has moved aggressively against the International Criminal Court, including sanctioning of prosecutors and judges for the indictment of Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. So as President Trump makes these dramatic moves to try to reshape U.S. relations with the UN and other international institutions, we thought it might make sense to take a step back and ask what American citizens think about these steps and about the United Nations in general, and whether or not they support the arguments that the administration is making. So in a sense, is the president channeling the interests and preferences of the American public, or is he out of step with public attitudes? Fortunately, we have two thoughtful commentators who are well placed to help educate us about what the American public thinks, as well as about the implications for the UN, including for the reform that is, in many cases, urgently needed in New York and throughout the entire UN system. Our two guests, let me introduce the first of them, is Steven Kull, who's director of the Program for Public Consultation, which conducted a recent survey of U.S. public attitudes. His polling shows surprisingly strong bipartisan support for multilateral cooperation in UN, the United Nations, and specific UN agencies, and even for the International Criminal Court, which the United States has not joined under either Democratic or Republican administrations. Our second commentator is Suzanne Nossel, also a good friend like Stephen. She's the former head of PEN America, and she's a longtime analyst of UN affairs. She served in senior U.S. government positions both at U.S. UN and at the State Department. And she recently wrote an excellent piece for Foreign Policy that we will put into the YouTube chat. And that piece argues that supporters of the United Nations and of American internationalism should seize upon the current crisis precipitated in large part by the United States to push through major, long overdue budgetary and structural reforms in the world body. So welcome to you both. Delighted to have you with us. for this conversation. We're going to begin with a discussion of some of the findings in Steven's latest survey, as well as of similar polls over the past year, to get a sense of public attitudes in the United States towards the UN. We'll also explore how the public assesses some of the various critiques that the Trump administration has lobbed at the world body. Then we'll hopefully pull back for a broader discussion of the domestic foundations of American internationalism, including some of the narratives that might resonate with the American public and ideally with elected officials. With luck, we'll also be able to save the last 10 minutes or 15 minutes or so for some questions from viewers, which you can put in the YouTube chat, and we will screen those and hopefully select a couple of them. Let me start with Steven. Wonderful to have you here. You've spent decades plumbing domestic public attitudes as well as global attitudes towards global issues. Donald Trump is often described as a populist, so it makes sense to think or ask how faithfully, in a sense, he's channeling sentiments of the American public, as opposed to a vocal minority. Can you give us some background of the poll you conducted, including a sense of the top line findings when it comes to multilateral cooperation on global issues, as well as particularly with respect to the UN? I think you may be muted, Steven. I think you may be muted. Is that possible? Believe you're still muted, Steven. There we go. No, it popped on for a second. Yeah, we're still not hearing you, unfortunately, Steven. Not sure what the. Yeah, you know what I might do, Steven, is, since we can't hear you right now, is I might move a little bit to Suzanne and then a return to you and as we get that sorted out. Suzanne, I've got a question about how you interpret this particular historic moment. We've seen crises, by the way, throughout. U.S.-UN relations have often been rocky. We saw it with respect to the crisis leading up to the Iraq War. During the 1980s, or 1970s, we heard Ambassador Moynihan refer to the UN as a dangerous place. I'm just interested in how you see this moment in historical perspective. I've always been struck by the ambivalence and selectivity of American global engagement, even at the height of American unipolarity, where the United States often was the sponsor of multilateral institutions and then pulled back. Do you see this particular moment as one of that is really unusual in historical perspective?
Yeah, well, first of all, great to be here, and I hope we have luck in troubleshooting with Steve. The history, as you say, of U.S.-UN relations is one of tension between the United States as the originator and founding member of the United Nations, the shaper of so many of its foundational instruments and norms, which are so heavily informed by the American legal tradition, by liberal internationalist ideas that have animated U.S. foreign policy. So in many ways, the UN is a scaffold of a world, a 20th century world made in large part by the United States. And yet Washington has always been ambivalent and had a love-hate relationship with the World Organization, complaining about its over-reliance on the United States for funding and finances, and the concern about a world government that would encroach on U.S. prerogatives of sovereignty. the idea of rogue nations being part of this world body and having a seat at the table. So those tensions are longstanding. We're now, I do think, at a pivotal moment where things may be taking more of a secular shift rather than just the swing of a pendulum. But I do see we have Steve back. And so before delving more deeply, I want to give a chance to go to his polling findings so that that can undergird our discussion as well.
Steven, do we have you? I still think you're on mute, unfortunately. Oh, wait, hold on. Say it again. Yeah, we're still unfortunately, we'll have to try again.
Yeah,
let me
let me go to the second part of your question, which is is this just part of the ebb and flow or something different in kind, what we're seeing right now? And I do think it probably is more than just the normal swing of the pendulum that we've seen for decades now between Republican and Democratic administrations. Democrats leaning in, the message of we're back, rejoining world bodies like the UN Human Rights Council and UNESCO, and then in Republican administrations often pulling back and a very different rhetoric and tone and more ambivalent posture. I do think this is something different. I mean, first of all, for the Trump administration, while, as you point out, he styles himself as a populist, as we all know, behind the scenes, pulling many of the puppet strings are a group of very staunchly right-wing and in some cases extremist organizations and individuals. And on the UN issues, there's a long-standing constituency that has been profoundly skeptical and hostile toward the UN. This goes back decades when the UN was sort of tarred as an organization of black helicopters and kind of a conspiratorial global cabal that was going to take over the world and override national governments and had to be kept in its place and should never have been created. And it's always been an extremist view. And I don't think the dominant prevailing attitude in the Trump administration is quite that. But if you look at Project 2025, some of the rhetoric actually is along the lines that probably you and I, Stewart, would agree with, acknowledging the utility of multilateral cooperation and that the U.S. can advance its interests through multilateral institutions, but also asserting a very staunch kind of nationalistic and self-interested point of view, whereby any organization that doesn't align fully with U.S. interests as defined by the project or by a particular administration doesn't deserve support. And so anything that goes against policies on issues of abortion or human rights or climate or other matters, the U.S. should just do an about face, essentially, is what Project 2025 spells out. There's no overarching obligation to be a part of the process. There's no sense in which collective interests and objectives should govern U.S. behavior and interaction with these institutions. And so kind of that much harder edged ideological orientation is in force in the Trump administration. And, as we see on a whole host of issues, whether it's immigration or the state of our public schools or what's happening in the university, it's not the average American whose opinion wins the day with the Trump administration. It's an activist, agitated contingent of heavily engaged influencers and activists that have the president's ear, that have an echo chamber that surrounds him, and that on many issues, though, are proving capable of really steering the policy direction and having a good deal of public acquiescence in the directions that they are setting. And I think that's essentially the pattern that we see with the United Nations. It's not that most Americans, if you had asked them, for their view of how to approach it, would have said we should withdraw and put everything under review and withhold our funding, but nor are they protesting that.
Right, exactly. I mean, this is something that I want when we get Steven back on, we want to address, because there are some quite striking findings of and really bipartisan findings of support for different international organizations, specific organizations from the United Nations Development Program to UNICEF to the World Food Program, et cetera, many of which are being decimated or entirely unfunded by the United States, World Health Organization as well. One of the questions is the salience of these findings, and whether or not politicians who are engaged in making these decisions feel like they're going to necessarily get punished by an electorate, whereas they might be getting punished by a subset of the electorate that feels very strongly and is mobilized about these things. But I know Steven's written quite a bit about that over the years. Can I ask, when you were at the U.S. mission to the UN or the State Department, and a lot of that, I mean, and when you were in the U.S. mission, you helped negotiate a solution to the arrears crisis for the United Nations, which of course is a perennial issue because the United States never really pays in full and on time, or rarely does. And you navigated. What was interesting back then, of course, was that there were guardrails in a sense. Well, first of all, the institutionalists were often in the executive branch, whether Republican or Democratic, and then of course there were internationalists on Capitol Hill. And I think there's no question we've seen just a momentous shift in that regard. Was public opinion an issue at all for you in those years when you were engaged in U.S. diplomacy?
Public opinion writ large, I would say, was at the margins, but congressional opinion was very much central. And I think when we get to Steven's findings, one of the things that struck me is that with virtually every question, whether about the United Nations overall or something more specific about a particular agency like the International Atomic Energy Agency, with each question, the person conducting the survey had to give the individual being polled a great deal of background on what this institution was, what its purposes were, its activities. And what that illustrates is you have to have almost a UN 101 course in order to even intelligently answer the question of whether you think the United States should be a part of these bodies, or whether these bodies are valuable. And I think that ignorance and just lack of information is crucial context in terms of evaluating these findings regarding public opinion. For us, congressional opinion was absolutely central because, as you say, we were working to repay more than $1 billion, which back then actually seemed like a lot of money, arrearage that the United States owed to the United Nations. And to do so, we needed a congressional appropriation. There was a piece of legislation, it seems so quaint now, it was called the Helms-Biden bill. It was Jesse Helms, kind of the arch right winger, and of course Joe Biden, the Democratic internationalist, and they actually came together with a package that we were working on implementing. So we had to keep both of them very much on side. And if we have more time, I can get into how we did it. But I see I can hear Steve, so I'm actually hopeful that we can finally get him going.
Yeah, thank you so much, Suzanne. We can definitely get back to that. And there's a lot there. So Steven, if we can hear you now, I'd love to get a sense of some of the top line findings of this very interesting poll, and then discuss again some of the nuances that went into that.
Sorry for all the difficulties. I really can't explain it, why we've had all these problems, and I'm still getting a huge amount of feedback coming through the system. But let me go ahead and talk a little bit about, oh my God, are you hearing all that feedback?
Yeah.
I'm not quite sure what to do about that. Maybe if
do you have another machine on, or is that the only one?
How about,
You still there, Steven?
Hello?
Yeah, that's good.
Did you lose me?
Yeah, no, we've got your video, we've got your audio, and that might be enough. Right? Yeah, we can hear you right now. Yeah,
that's all we really need. Okay, let's just proceed with that.
Super.
All right, so you were asking about Americans' views on the United Nations and multilateralism in general. Basically, the American public has been very positive toward the United Nations and the U.S. participating in it. They just regard that as just a given. It's not something super spectacular or highly successful. The United Nations, they see it as having a lot of problems, as being a bloated bureaucracy, and not achieving a lot on a lot of fronts. But sure, why not is the basic response. Now, when you give people pro and con arguments, they respond favorably. They find convincing arguments on both sides, but they find the arguments in favor stronger. And the primary arguments that are compelling is that we have a lot of global problems, and they have to be dealt with in a global framework. Another is that it's a way of burden sharing. And also, if we fail to continue to participate in the UN, we're going to basically relinquish that to China and to Russia. Now, they're all, but as I say, the con arguments, well, it's better to go one-on-one and so on. Those are compelling. But when it comes right down to it, should the United Nations work through the UN and UN agencies more, the same, or less? 52% say more, 32% say the same, and only 16% say less. Republicans are a bit less supportive, but still 74% say the same or more. So Democrats are higher. So it's quite unequivocal that we should continue. This isn't the end all be all. Now, we also went through the different agencies, specific agencies, and for each one we explained what they do and how much goes to them. By the way, we've surveyed in the past on this question. People have the idea that the UN is a much bigger thing than it actually is, and involves much more money than it does. So you can see, given the amount of money they think is actually being spent there, it's pretty understandable that they think it should be more effective than it is. But when they're told how much goes to these different agencies, we looked at UN peace operations, World Health Organization, World Food Program, UN Development Program, UN Environmental Program, the Refugee Program, IAEA. Most of them got 8 and 10, supporting the U.S. continuing to participate. Republicans a little lower, more like 7 and 10, as low as 6 and 10 on the refugee program. That was the least popular, but the IAEA 8 and 10. So it's very robust. And again, if you are a politician who wants to speak against the UN and starts criticizing the UN, and people will nod. They'll go, yeah, those are good critiques. Yeah, those are good critiques. Yeah, you got a point there. But when it comes down to what should we actually do, they're pretty definitively, let's stay on the program.
It's very interesting, Stephen. I found the numbers quite striking. And I mean, it is. And I just want to pick up a little bit on your point about the modesty of funding, which, of course, this influences U.S. attitudes, public attitudes towards foreign assistance too, as well, which official development assistance is much smaller as a percentage, much smaller as a percentage of GDP than people tend to believe, and of the federal budget. Peacekeeping, I will just note that the United States spent $1.5 billion on peacekeeping in the most recent year that we have figures for, and that's half of the size of the city budget of Orlando, Florida. The other thing that I point to is the entire budget of the United States for the United Nations is about 2/3 of what Americans spend on ice cream every year. Now, Americans like ice cream, so that might still seem like quite a bit, but it's a very, very small percentage, about 1.5% of all UN funding from the United States, of what the United States spends on the Defense Department. So it is quite striking, the degree to which the numbers are quite modest, and the the percentages of general support are strong. The one thing that I would say that was as a little bit of a caveat, and you did mention the fact that that there is some level of dissatisfaction of the UN's performance overall. Overall, it seems like the public seems to support multilateralism, that is going it with others versus unilateralism, going it alone. And that seems quite strong. But there was a wrinkle in your findings. There still is a modest preference for multilateralism over bilateralism. But I guess the one thing that did jump out a little bit was what you might term the Gulliver critique of the United Nations, which is one that I think is that the Trump administration, is clearly attracted to. That it's better to do bilateral one-on-one negotiations. I'm not saying that this is as strong as the preference for multilateralism, but they did seem to find that relatively persuasive. Was that be a fair assessment of?
We tried both pros and cons, and in every case, the majority found the cons at least somewhat convincing. And one of those cons was it's better for the U.S. to act bilaterally, one-on-one. We have more control, and we can pursue our interests more directly while working through the UN. There's an expectation that we're going to in some way moderate them. And again, people go, yeah, that's a point, that's consideration. But in the end, they clearly decide to go the multilateral route.
Yeah.
And this has been this way for some time. This is there's really no indication that there's been any real change on this front.
Gotcha. Can I ask about in terms of getting to Suzanne's very interesting comment about providing context and education? Because I mean, arguably, this is a matter of sort of either civic education or education by folks who are in favor of U.S. support for multilateral institutions. Is this sort of, oh, by the way, this is what WFP does, right? The World Food Program actually does. Are there, what are the implications of that in terms of, in a sense, building or allowing, if you think that there is a general predisposition towards multilateralism, where is, how do you make that argument, both in terms of where, what these institutions actually do and how they actually fulfill concrete U.S. interests and advance concrete U.S. values? Are there?
Stewart, I'm not sure Steve heard my comment because I know he was on troubleshooting.
Yeah, basically what Suzanne said was that, look, it appeared that you actually have to bring in a certain amount of education and context to actually explain what these organizations do, how they, in a sense, demonstrate that they actually have some value in terms of, they're not just bureaucracies.
It's true that people with higher education in general are substantially more supportive of participation in the UN than people with lower education. But with lower education, you still have a majority in favor. Now, in the survey that we did, we gave the people the information, the arguments, the amount of money, and so on, and got their response. But other polls from, more standard polls have found you still get clear majorities, not as high. The more information you get, the more they sort of comes into focus, and they favor it. There are many fewer don't know responses, but you still get 60 to 65%. Is supporting participation in the World Health Organization and so on. And the Chicago Council for decades has asked a question about whether it should be a priority to strengthen the United Nations, and you consistently, and that's all just should we or shouldn't we, and you get 80% or so saying the US that it should be a foreign policy goal of the US to strengthen the UN. So it's always a tendency to think, well, if the public really understood this and it would make a difference. I'm not sure that the problem is with the public, or the problem is the public not understanding the situation. They understand enough to know that they think it makes sense, and and that's a constant. There's there might be some individuals who have ideas that they're black helicopters coming from the UN and so on that contact their member of Congress, and so you get the impression that this is some real big widespread feeling out there, but it's really not, so I don't think that educating the public will, in a sense, change the situation a lot, because they're already basically supportive in a not in a super intense way, but yeah, that makes sense kind of way, and there's nothing. I mean, the idea of pushing back or rolling back U.S. participation is an elite idea. It's not it's not something that comes from below. And it's really even hard to talk the public out of supporting it, but it's not an intense support. It's not the kind of thing that people decide who they're going to vote for. But it's when they decide to vote, it's one little thing that has a little bit of effect on their overall impression of candidates or the parties. And on this one, those who are supportive are just seen as more appropriate to the current situation.
Right. You've said in the past, there's often politicians will often think of the public as sort of an animal force, or having volatile sense of the public opinion is volatile, and elites, in a sense, shouldn't pay attention to that. But in some ways, you seem to flip that argument on its head at times, and sort of saying that actually there is greater stability in terms of public opinion. Do you still find that?
There's a tremendous amount of research showing that the public is really very stable, and all these swings that we get from one administration to the next, in and out of the Paris Agreement and so on, those don't reflect any swings in American public opinion. These are swings in terms of who's in the White House, who's dominant in Congress. The public just doesn't shift that much. It's more stable than the discourse of the policy elite, and it's certainly more stable than the decisions that come out of the White House from administration to administration.
Let me ask about, we'll open it up a little bit and bring Suzanne back here in a second. But I'm interested in whether or not it sounds like in terms of trend lines, things have been. You have not seen huge shifts over, in recent decades on some of these things. I'm wondering, though, if there are, demographic factors at play in polling trends on U.S. and international engagement, and what the implications of that might be. I mean, I don't know whether or not you've done something this fine-grained, but I'm interested. Are there generational elements? Are there sort of, does America's changing ethnic composition play into this at all? Progressives, in a sense, used to count on both factors and helping make their case on many fronts, right? They thought that the trend was their friend, that that perhaps younger people would be sort of more globalist in orientation or internationalist in orientation, that people having more immigrants, et cetera, would have, sort of a greater support for international cooperation. Do you find any evidence for that, or are aware of any evidence?
Actually, there is some evidence to the contrary. There is, and there isn't enough data to make a really strong case on this, but there is some data out there that show that younger people who have generally tended to be a bit more internationalist are and more pro engagement are a bit less now. The Chicago Council survey about playing an active part in world affairs, that has gone down among younger people. We didn't find any consistent pattern here. It was pretty much the same on some questions, that the younger people were a little lower, but we didn't find a higher level of support among young people. I do think that there is a perception that the U.S. has gotten involved with a number of, certainly the Iraq War and Afghanistan War, the whole war on terror was seen, initially as, oh, okay, yeah, we got to do that, but they then got less and less satisfied with that. So there's a wariness of that. I think that's probably the primary reference point.
Suzanne, I'm interested in your reaction, or what was your reaction when you looked at Steven's polling data, in terms of, from a policymaker's perspective, in terms of how, and an analyst of trends in U.S. foreign policy.
Sure.
Do you have a sense of, how does it dovetail with what policymakers actually feel about the public's mindset? And then perhaps even more of a blunt question, does what the public thinks actually matter, given this, what seems to be a relatively longstanding disconnect between the posture of U.S. policymakers, their posture that they adopt toward the UN and international organizations versus what apparently a relatively informed public can indicate as what it supports.
Yeah, look, I may be playing a bit of the devil's advocate here, but I actually really don't think it matters much. I don't think it ever has. When I was talking about the work that I did during the Clinton administration to settle U.S. arrears to the UN, and public opinion didn't matter much. Congressional opinion mattered a great deal, but what members of Congress care about is not sort of these background attitudes that may be revealed in the Chicago Council survey, but they care about what they're hearing about at their town halls, what people are calling up their office about, they're getting letters about, what they think are going to be the most salient voting issues among their constituency. And I think it's been decades since the UN would have even rated on that list. I remember when I was at USUN, this is in the late 90s, 2000, we didn't want the UN to be a voting issue because we thought it was unpopular and it would only be unhelpful because of the UN scandals at the time. But I think what we now see, we are living in an attention economy where a great deal revolves around what is salient, what's on people's minds, what issues are resonating publicly. We see on immigration, this notion of an immigration crisis. Yes, there's some reality to it, but we know right now, border crossings are at an all-time low, and yet there's still this sense that we're in the throes of an immigration crisis. The universities being made into a zone of crisis. So we're not in a world where this kind of latent underlying public opinion really counts for a great deal. And I think the UN has lost a lot of ground when it comes to capturing any slice of the American mental pie and garnering any attention. Years ago, even sometimes it was negative, but on the Iraq War, there was a dramatic showdown with Colin Powell in the well of the Security Council with his PowerPoint. But that hasn't happened in decades. During the Biden administration, things were very quiet at the United Nations. The UN played some part on Ukraine, and there were some votes that signified the extent of global support for what the United States and its allies were doing in defense of Ukraine. And that was probably the high watermark. But the UN didn't play a role in resolving that conflict or the conflict in Gaza. The Security Council is known, almost exclusively for being deadlocked. So there's very little that comes out of that body that's of interest to the American public, or that people are actually talking about on the radio or on social media. And likewise, the rest of the United Nations, the individuals involved, whether it's the Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, or we have a couple of prominent Americans who are in prominent roles, Amy Pope running the International Organization of Migration, Doreen Bogdan-Martin at the International Telecommunications Union, which is a very important body when it comes to digital regulation. No one knows their names. We never hear from them. They're not part of the discourse. Cindy McCain running the World Food Program. I don't think many Americans realize she's there. She is a more recognizable name. But the UN has really receded in the public mind in a way that members of Congress really have no reason to be concerned that the attitudes that Steve has documented are actually going to manifest on a day-to-day basis. And, we didn't see any pushback over the abolition of USAID, very little minimal public pushback on something so dramatic. And so the idea that there would be public pushback in terms of what the administration is doing on the UN, I think is just not something that enters anyone's mind. And if the question is, what would it take to revive Americans' commitment to the United Nations and to international cooperation, I'm just not sure. It's a positive thing, without a doubt, that there's this latent public support. If it were otherwise, that would be a challenge and a hurdle. But I actually don't think it gets us very far in of itself.
Can I pick up on that a little bit? This latent sort of relatively positive assessment of the UN, notwithstanding the fact that obviously much of the public is aware that the UN has not been able to resolve the Gaza crisis, has not been able to resolve the Ukraine war. And some of that, of course, is things are often laid at the feet of the United Nations when, of course, it's a function of geopolitical disagreements amongst the most powerful members, not least within the UN Security Council. So, it's very easy to tar the UN as such with a broad brush. But there is this latent positive view of the United Nations. I guess another provocative question to you, Suzanne, building on your foreign policy piece, is the president and his administration obviously have a negative impression of the United Nations. I guess my question would be, do you think the public has too rosy a picture of the UN without appreciating its dysfunction? In your recent piece for foreign policy, you noted some pretty astounding aspects in terms of inefficiency or redundancy and certain aspects, including mandates that have been created that sort of are past their sell-by date and in need of major reform. Can you walk us through your argument a little bit here in terms of some of the needed reforms that you see, and how do we make, to the degree that this is a dire situation for the United Nations, potentially existential. Are there opportunities to make lemonade out of lemons, and for skeptical friends, I guess I would say, of the United Nations, to turn this crisis into something of an opportunity?
Yeah, I mean, one thing when I was reading Steve's survey results, when he sort of goes through the case for and against the UN and whether people agree with those arguments, I sort of felt like I agree with almost all of those arguments. They're all sort of true at a certain level. And I consider myself a great supporter and kind of champion of the UN over the years, but nonetheless, I think the organization is bloated. I think there are times where it's easier for the United States to work bilaterally. It's sort of all of the above would have been my answer. But in this piece that you mentioned, I talk about this as a pivot moment because the UN now is in serious crisis in light of what the Trump administration is doing. They're making drastic across the board spending cuts, mandating every official in the system to slash 20% or more of their staffs and all of their expenses. And I see that as a real opportunity. I mean, anyone who's worked in a business or an organization knows that when you have to shrink, you actually don't want to just do it across the board in a blunderbuss way, but you really have to think strategically, particularly at a moment like this, where this is not a momentary thing. I mean, whether the U.S. contributions ever go back to what they were ex ante is a question. And you also have other governments pulling back on their voluntary commitments to the United Nations, designating and directing more of their funding so that the UN has less flexible support. And the UN rightly is taking this moment. It's the organization's 80th anniversary to do a lot of self-examination. And they did one report on mandates, which are essentially the orders that the United Nations Secretariat gets from all of the different political bodies, the Security Council, the General Assembly, the Human Rights Council, Economic and Social Council. And they can call for reports or missions or the mandating of experts to carry out research, all sorts of things. And this report documented that the UN adds more than 600 mandates every year. It has 40,000 still active mandates. Last year in 2024, the UN held 27,000 meetings, costing $360 million just for documents and translation. And there are dozens of subjects that are raised and discussed where mandates are created in multiple bodies that overlap. There's no way to surface this overlap or rationalize it over time. And so you have enormous repetition and a lack of differentiation of the roles of these different bodies. UN reports have ballooned in length. They're very read by very few people. The longer they get, the fewer people are actually reading them. So it makes a really strong case for the need for reform, and that the UN is this bloated, out of control entity. And it's not a surprise in a way. It's not the fault of the UN. You have 193 member states, each of whom have their own priorities and can propose these resolutions and horse trade. And what you get is an agenda run amok that nobody would say is fit for purpose in 2025. And so what I argue in the piece is that the UN has to seize on this crisis where it has a legitimate, genuine need to restructure itself and streamline dramatically and combine some of the organizations that have overlapping functions, whether it's the High Commissioner for Refugees and the Organization for Migration, or the UN Population Fund with UN Women. And these organizations are each sacrosanct. They have their supporters. They have countries that invested in creating them. There are countries that have a lock on the leadership positions or other senior roles in these institutions. And so there's all kinds of institutional inertia at work that makes it very difficult to reform the UN. But I do see this as a moment of crisis, and kind of the mantra of never waste a crisis. I think this is an opportunity to slim down the organization so that when there does come a moment where we can reopen the debate in the United States, we're actually able to say, this is not the UN that you remember. This is a body that has adapted, that no longer is sprawling over 1,000 different topics, but that really has an agenda of 3 or 4 things that it is doing well and efficiently, and really be able to make the case. I mean, I think one thing Elon Musk taught us is that a bloated bureaucracy is, that's a silent killer. I mean, someone can come after you. And I think that's, what is happening for the UN, and kind of has been brewing for a long time, that the organization has allowed itself to become kind of flaccid, and even it overwhelms. There's so many valuable, life-saving pieces of work that are being done, UN bodies that, if they didn't exist, you could never replace them, and get all of those countries around the table talking about vital international threats, mobilizing humanitarian assistance, the climate change process that the UN has put together. And so you don't want an organization freighted down by all sorts of other things that distract attention away from those crucial areas where the UN really can make a difference.
Yeah, absolutely agree that there's some level of, obviously you want it to be done in a thoughtful, methodical approach that leads to some level of prioritization, as opposed to, I think one of the complaints about what the Secretary General is doing, and he's doing it, because obviously in huge response to what the Trump administration is doing, is just a very sort of across the board, as you said, sort of blunderbuss approach where, it would be much better if it were done in a little bit more of a judicious manner. But the hope would be, I guess, that in the second stage of the reform process, that there would be beginning to be this rationalization and streamlining. Again, I'll just reinforce a point you made that because these agencies and departments and programs report to different masters, to ECOSOC or to the UN General Assembly or what have you, the reform priorities depending on, where you sit within the international community, can be quite different, so that you'll have some saying, let's stick to the peace and security knitting, and then others will say, no, this is all about development and for some of the world's poorest countries. So, but absolutely, I like your point a lot. I'm going to come back to you in a second, Suzanne, but let me just also make an announcement that we have the queue open for questions, which we'll turn to in just a second, so please put them in the chat, on the YouTube chat. Stephen, I was interested in terms of the arguments that work best in terms of persuading the public about the utility of cooperation through the United Nations and multilateral institutions in general. And there were a number that sort of jumped out at me. Some of them sort of directly opposed to, in a sense, some of the rationales that the administration is making for actually cutting back. And I was thinking, you mentioned a couple of them. One of them is the need to focus on collective action to address transnational threats. Another is the benefits of burden sharing in terms of reducing costs for the United States. I mean, if you wanted to reduce overstretch, for instance, of course, burden sharing would be something that you might want to emphasize. Another is the sort of concrete material benefits that the UN provides. And I don't feel like that case, in the same way with foreign aid, is made very successfully to the United States. So that's a third one, the benefits. There's ethical considerations, of course, which would sort of militate against sort of draconian cuts in humanitarian assistance on the part of the United States. And then there's the sort of vacuum you create for bad actors or adversaries within the corridors of the United Nations, right? I mean, if we're cutting back, we're no longer the world's leading donor, then of course that would fall to the next leading donor, which now becomes the leading donor, China, and presumably that means China getting more say all across the board, not least in personnel and senior leadership. Do you have a sense of is it a heterogeneous collection of of motivations and arguments that hold water, or are there particular?
Yeah, all of those are really significant and on a kind of day-to-day basis. But if we go to the question of what is the foundation of the support for the UN, I would say it is fundamentally collective security. That it comes out of the sense that we really need to establish some kind of international law against cross-border aggression. The principle of collective security, that nations need to join together to repel aggression by any aggressor, to uphold the international law against cross-border aggression, is, I think, the foundation of it, and everything else comes in on top of it. Yeah, all the good cooperate in that way. Yeah, we have collective problems related to the environment and so on. But I think the real foundation of it is that, and I think the Gulf War was a kind of prime example of what Americans think that the UN should be doing. And then there's more. We also haven't mentioned the International Criminal Court, which is of course not part of the United Nations, but is another example of a powerful multilateral institution, or potentially powerful, or a significant one, I should say. And I was, if you asked me what did I find most surprising, because what was the level of support for the International Criminal Court. 62% favor the U.S. joining the International Criminal Court, and even when it was the concern about that the ICC may go after a leader of an ally was discussed, and that did not dissuade people, and they majorities strongly oppose the idea of sanctioning the ICC, or sanctioning people who work for the ICC, or their staff, or Americans who provide assistance. So again, this comfort with the idea of multilateral institutions.
That's very interesting, particularly with respect to the ICC, because of course the ICC is different in some ways. I mean, and the reason why neither Democratic nor Republican administrations have actually, I mean, it was signed under the Clinton administration, but has never sort of really pursued ratification of it, is that it actually does, in a significant way, impinge on American sovereignty in the sense of allowing, in principle, a prosecutor to stand in judgment of the accuracy and credibility of U.S. Judicial proceedings. So that is quite. I find that, particularly on the sovereignty front, surprising. A little surprising that the public would be quite as overall in terms of majority being in favor of the U.S. Joining the ICC, given that. Are there any, last question to you, Stephen, then we'll go to a couple of questions online. Obviously, one of the trends that we've seen is with the Trump administration is the push towards a unitary executive, a push towards great prerogative, even greater prerogative in terms of what the president can do in foreign policy and making decisions that, frankly, override constitutional prerogatives of Congress with respect to foreign aid and all kinds of commitments that have been made. Is there any other polling that you've seen about the level of comfort of the American people with respect to a unitary executive or in a sense an untrammeled White House compared to checks and balances, including in foreign policy?
Yeah, we've done surveys on the question. Others have done it as well, and the answer is really quite unequivocal that there's discomfort with the idea of expanding the power of the president. There's support for independent agencies, and this is bipartisan. So, historically, whenever the subject of the use of force has come up, it's always, and we ask, or anybody asks, should Congress play a role in this decision? Should the Congress have basically veto power over this use of force? Clear majorities say that it should. So this idea of expanding presidential powers is simply not popular.
Thank you. Thanks, Stephen. Let me go to one of these questions. There's a number of questions here. Let's start with this one, and I'll ask Suzanne. The question here is question number 2 here was, can the UN do more to intervene in crisis areas such as Gaza and Ukraine, including to protect civilians? I'd be interested also, Stephen, if as a follow-up, if you have any polling data on the degree to which that's a concern of the American people.
Yeah. One thing that's vital to remember is the UN is its member states. And I work for Ambassador Richard Holbrooke, and he used to make the joke that it was like blaming sort of Madison Square Garden, the building, for the Knicks losing the game. And so, can the UN do more in a place like Ukraine and Gaza? The thing about Ukraine, of course, is that Russia is on the Security Council and they have a veto. And so the idea of UN monitors coming in or other protective activities would have to have Russian approval and wouldn't. And, there's another question I see that came into the chat. Can the Uniting for Peace resolution be used for crisis situations? And, that's relevant to this discussion as well. The Uniting for Peace resolution was passed by the UN General Assembly, which is, of course, the body of the whole during the Korean War, because the Soviet Union was vetoing Security Council action. And so they passed a resolution saying that if the Security Council is stymied by a veto, the General Assembly can issue sort of recommendations in relation to a conflict situation, but those recommendations are not binding. And the General Assembly has issued resolutions in support of Ukraine, but again, it hasn't led to a resolution of the conflict nor an opening for any kind of UN action on civilian protection. In Gaza, it's a different situation where you have this long-standing UN presence, UN Relief Works Agency, that's a specially constituted refugee agency that was created after 1948 and provides a whole range of services. It runs all of the schools, for example, in Gaza, and provides a lot of the other public services, and is an essential underpinning of how Gazan society has worked. That's become very complicated because Israel has accused UNRWA of being infiltrated by Hamas members and supporters, and it's an organization with a lot of employees that's deeply embedded in Gazan society. And so I think there's probably unavoidably some interplay there. And it's also not a civilian protection organization. They're not going to be in the position of actually, they do shelter people at UN schools, but sometimes those schools have been targeted on the basis of Israel saying that they are being used as Hamas command centers or for other military purposes that render them legitimate military targets. And so the UN operation there has been very challenged, and most recently in relation to the provision of food and the problem of starvation in Gaza, where now the United States has set up this parallel with Israel, a Gaza humanitarian initiative to try to work around UNRWA, which they don't see as credible, and that has been seemingly so far judged largely as a fiasco. So the sad answer is, in theory, absolutely. In reality, there are a lot of hurdles in the way in both cases.
Superb. Thank you, Suzanne. Stephen, I'm going to come to you in a second, but let me just to try my hand on a couple of these as well. Can the UN do more to intervene in crisis areas such as Gaza and Ukraine? Obviously, if we're speaking about certain things that would require some peace enforcement or some peacekeeping force, et cetera, you're really talking about having some consensus amongst the P5, the permanent 5 members of the UN Security Council. And there, obviously that's not going to be happening in Ukraine anytime soon unless there's really a rapprochement with respect to and an understanding amongst the P5, including Russia and the United States, but also our European allies and China, about what that would look like. And you just haven't had that. And with respect to Gaza, again, you have a situation there where one of the parties to the conflict is obviously has a very strong relationship with the United States and has been, in a sense, protected and arguably insulated by the United States. So again, they're getting, it's not impossible, but it's going to be very difficult. In terms of the Uniting for Peace resolution used in crisis situations, I'll just note that there has been growing activity amongst and activism amongst the members of the UN General Assembly recently, and partly in the context of the Ukraine war and the use of the veto by the Russians. There's been a member, I believe it was Liechtenstein, I think, a small UN member state that launched the veto initiative, unless it's Austria. I believe it's Liechtenstein. They basically got the General Assembly approval that whenever a veto is cast within the UN Security Council, there's an expectation or a request that the vetoing player come to explain themselves in front of the UN General Assembly, and so there are some workarounds in addition for Uniting for Peace to try to hold the UN Security Council accountable. There is a last question here, which I might take a stab at as well. Where does conservative hostility to international organizations really come from? Bureaucracy can become complicated over time, sure, but is it the thinking that America is so great that there's no need to engage? Conservative hostility to the UN and international organizations is often very frequently couched in national sovereignty grounds, and there are a number of different complaints there. One of them is that some of these the contention is made that some of these organizations really involve a hierarchical relationship of subordination to a supranational authority. And the United Nations is often criticized for being that, but it is in fact not that. The European Union has supranational dimensions, but almost exclusively the United Nations and other multilateral organizations are horizontal relationships amongst voluntarily entered into treaties and otherwise. The conservative talking point, however, is that they involve surrender. What they do involve is some delegation of authority, voluntary delegation of authority, between the principals, that is the member states, and the agents, which is the United Nations, to actually do things on their behalf. And they involve some pooling of that authority as well. So they do require you to basically permit is to voluntarily restrict some freedom of action you would otherwise exercise. And so that is a major that is a major talking point amongst conservatives, that it violates American sovereignty and to some degree violates U.S. freedom of action. And then, of course, there's the bureaucratic issue. And it's compounded by the fact that the United States, of course, has more more unilateral, bilateral, and minilateral options available to it than just about any other country in the world. So, Steven, wanted to come back to you and see if you had.
Let me add a point on that. I think there's a lot of it is rooted in a kind of Manichaean worldview, and the idea of us engaging with bad actors legitimates them in some way, and gives them, in a sense, some kind of power over us, and that there has been legislation in Congress for many years for the U.S. to withdraw from the UN, but not simply withdraw, but to create a new multilateral entity that includes only democracies with some kind of human rights record, positive human rights record. So, anything, it's perceived that anything that we do to engage these bad actors lowers our ethical standing.
I know it would be interesting. Go ahead.
No, I was just going to say I'd add one more kind of related point, which is, the UN can be a tough environment for the United States in terms of getting things done. There can be a lot of pushback as far as our goals. The United States can be thwarted. George W. Bush didn't get support for the Iraq War. The U.S. couldn't get support for intervening in Kosovo. In some cases in Iraq, you might agree in retrospect that that was a wise decision, and that the UN membership, the Security Council membership, had a more accurate assessment of the situation than the United States did. But that can be frustrating. It can sometimes, you mentioned sort of the Gulliver analogy, but the idea that it's all these countries coming together to tie the United States down, or countries that have a different set of values, that there's a very strong anti-colonialist streak in the United Nations, a sense, sometimes an anti-Western view that the West has been too dominant, that the creation and formulation of this organization is an enshrining of Western values in a way that cuts out the rest of the world. And so you see in many different UN bodies manifestations of that sort of frustration and tension. And so it makes it kind of easy for the United States to ridicule some of the resolutions that get introduced, for example, in the UN Human Rights Council on, pet issues that might originate in a part of the world, that doesn't seem salient or pressing to the United States delegation. And, that some of that's legitimate. It's not necessarily an easy place for the United States to work its well. I mean, I've argued throughout my career that when we go about it in a focused way and we really lay the groundwork, the United States can get a lot done and can marshal consensus sometimes in unexpected ways and overcome that hostility. But it is a factor. And I think, one concern as we look going forward is with the United States retreating, its influence is going to further diminish. I think the Chinese and the Russians see a great opening and opportunity here to continue to reconfigure the organization according to their designs. And it's a project that China in particular has been engaged in for some time, installing more of their personnel and introducing their ideas to shape, for example, the human rights discourse. And I think they'll go further with that, probably quietly, because they don't need to draw a lot of attention to it. But if the U.S. kind of does come back in force, it may find a substantially less hospitable organization after that period of absence. And so, that's something we're just going to have to reckon with, those of us who believe in multilateral cooperation and who want to try to forge a path back.
Yeah, just picking up on those great comments, Suzanne, there was this sort of holiday, in a way, sort of post-Cold War holiday, where there was this sense, and some euphoria, relatively short-lived, but where there was a sense that the United Nations, now freed of these sort of geopolitical superpower competition, and also sort of the whole colonial nationalism era, decolonization, et cetera, could conceivably move forward in a much more cooperative manner. And I think that one thing we've seen over the last couple of decades, of course, is that geopolitics has reasserted itself, and North-South grievances as well have reasserted themselves. And so you get this sort of surprising persistence and even renaissance and renewal of concepts like the global South, and East-West tensions as well. And it will be interesting to see, presuming the United States does at some stage engage more in the United Nations than the Trump administration is choosing to in a future administration. It will be interesting to see the necessary adjustments that the United States will have to make to be in a normatively and value-wise much more diverse organization than it has been in the past. And in a sense, adjusting to, you can overdo the degree to which we're moving into a multipolar world, but given the extraordinary strength of the United States in particular, and of course of China as well. But it will be interesting to see how the United States, which has always had, as we've been talking about, this very ambivalent relationship with the United Nations, in a sense makes peace with the world body in a world that is really a very diverse and plural world. And also how it navigates its relationship with the United Nations as the premier body, in a sense, of world order, with sort of a more flexible world of multi-alignment, in which there are a lot of big bodies out, a lot of important bodies, flexible arrangements outside the United Nations itself. I want to wrap up, but I'll probably give just the last comment to Steven. I guess to make a pitch for why public opinion is important for us to look at in terms of foreign policy, and why politicians and policymakers who don't always pay attention to it would be wise to devote their energy to doing so.
As you probably know, the level of trust in the U.S. government among the public is really quite low, and there's just generally a pretty negative view. We did an in-depth study on what are the roots of that, and the key finding was the perception that policymakers pay very little attention to the public's views, that we don't really have a democracy in the mind of most Americans, and that creates lots of problems in terms of the relationship between the government and the people, and it also creates this sort of urge to try this, try that, this kind of swinging from one party to the next. So I think it's definitely overall a very destabilizing situation for the government to be perceived this way in a democracy, and this non-responsiveness to the public on the question of multilateralism is just one more example of the differences between where the public is and the government. I mean, if you think about it, the government is a kind of entity that, and people work for that entity, have the interest in empowering that entity. The public sees the federal government as one entity among others, including the UN, that has the potential for serving their interests and values. And the perception is that the federal government is in a sense too and the people who work there are too self-serving in terms of trying to enhance that power, when a more cooperative approach may be more advantageous. So it's not just what the UN does and what the federal government does relative to it. It's in this broader context of how democratic is the system that we're in.
Thank you so much, Steven, and also Suzanne. It's been a great pleasure having this conversation. I think we got a lot out on the table, and I think it's good context as we approach the opening of the UN General Assembly in just a couple of weeks for its historic 80th anniversary. Look forward to continuing this conversation with both of you, and to being in touch in the months ahead.
Thanks so much. Great to be with you.
Thanks for having us.
Okay. Thanks, guys.